As likely all of our viewers know, January 31st is the day that the UK is set to, at long last, leave the European Union. The date has been a long time coming, but on the 31st, after speeches, projections, parties, and maybe even a little bong from Big Ben, the UK will have officially left the EU. And when the day dawns on the 1st of February, the UK will officially no longer be a member of the Union. So in this video, we're going to answer a simple question. What changes? In this video, we're going to be specifically looking at what will change for UK citizens, and in the coming days, we'll be putting out an equivalent video talking about the changes for those in the EU, specifically Europeans living in the UK. That video will be out on the TLDR EU channel later this week, so be sure to head over there and subscribe to be notified when it's released. There's a link to the EU channel down below. So it's the morning of February 1st, 2020. Brexit has happened, the UK has left, and what's changed? Well, honestly, not much. In fact, so little that we found two almost identical articles explaining how similar life will be post-January 31st. That's because even though the UK will no longer be an EU member, the UK is still in the transition period, meaning that a lot of EU laws and procedures still apply. The idea is that during the transition period, the current rules continue, while both sides are able to come up with a new trade deal. This gives the UK and EU a tight timeframe of 11 months, in which time they'll need to negotiate, as well as give businesses and individuals the chance to adapt to the new reality. Essentially though, it makes this video slightly less interesting than you might have hoped, as a lot of things won't be changing at the end of January. Instead, the major change is going to take place at the end of 2020, when the transition period ends. It's then that both sides will move to their new deal, or it's possible that there'll be a no-deal Brexit. So we'll wait until the end of the year to make that video, and today let's focus on the immediate effects. As I mentioned a moment ago, while researching this video, I stumbled upon two almost identical articles laying out what's going to happen on the 31st of January. Now, I'm not accusing anyone of copying the homework, but if this is the official format that everyone's going by, let's stick with it. And in the same order as everyone else, let's discuss the changes, or more accurately, the lack of changes. Firstly, holidays. If you have any trips planned to the EU, don't worry, Brits can still travel to anywhere in the EU without the need for a visa or any other official documents. When it comes to EU travel in 2020, nothing is set to change. After the transition period, the rules will very likely change, however it probably won't affect most travellers. A press release from April of last year confirmed the EU Council and Parliament have agreed to allow UK citizens visa-free access to the Schengen area for 90 days. This visa exemption was granted on the condition of reciprocity. Essentially, the UK has to return the favour and allow EU citizens visa-free travel to the UK. As the press release notes, the UK seems open to this, and it doesn't seem likely that a visa will be required to travel in either direction, as long as it's only for shorter trips. Next, if you're looking to work in the EU, either on a full-time or summer job basis, then you'll be absolutely fine doing so during 2020. That's because during the transition period, all freedom of movement rules are protected. That means the holidays we mentioned a moment ago, but also working abroad. Ultimately, if you want to work visa-free in Europe, you still have the right to throughout the transition period. However, it's worth noting that this freedom of movement is very likely to end at the end of 2020, and from that point onwards, it could get harder, especially if you're looking to do a full-time role. If you do want to begin working in the EU full-time, it's worth checking with your future employer how they're willing to support you after the end of 2020 if necessary. Okay, so what about retirement? Some Brits love to complain about immigrants moving to the UK, but at the same time, millions of Brits move to the EU each year, with hundreds of thousands of pensioners choosing to retire in Europe. Unsurprisingly, they're attracted to beautiful and warm countries like Spain, Italy, and France. Retirees who are already settled in Europe before the end of 2020 will keep most of the EU rights they currently enjoy for the rest of their lives. This means that if you're thinking of retiring in Europe, you want to do it soon in order to lock down the rights of EU citizenship. The rights of retirees in the future is still yet to be negotiated, but if freedom of movement is scrapped, the right to retire in sunnier climates could soon end. Brits who want to study in Europe have full access to study through the Erasmus scheme. The scheme allowed more than 17,000 UK citizens to study abroad in the 2017-18 academic year, as well as allowing 31,000 EU students to study in the UK. International students are incredibly important to a number of British universities, with their fees making up a large percentage of many institutions' funding. Therefore, many universities and students are hoping that the programme will be protected after Brexit. However, the future of Erasmus and studying abroad is still somewhat up in the air, and depends on the exact deal that the UK and EU reach. However, if you're already signed up to study in Europe on one of their 2020 programmes, you're unlikely to be affected. If you want to study in Europe after this, you'll have to wait and see what's agreed in the new Brexit deal. That being said, the UK government has been in favour of protecting the scheme in the past, saying that as we enter negotiations with the EU, we want to ensure that UK and European citizens can continue to benefit from each other's world-leading education systems. Like study abroad programmes, scientific funding is also important to many UK institutions. British citizens will continue to have access to the Horizon 2020 programme, and would still be able to apply for its funding. On top of this, the EU's Creative Europe funding stream, iPortunus, and the UK's European Prize for Literature all still open for British applicants in 2020. Also, Brits continue to have access to the European Regional Development Funds and the European Social Funds until the end of the transition period. Once the transition period has ended, Brits will lose access to all of these schemes, and as European Union schemes, there's no reason to suspect they'll be returned through any kind of deal, unless it was an incredibly close relationship. Scientific funding isn't the only kind of funding Brits might expect from the EU, with EU arts funding becoming important for many in the UK. And as you might have guessed, it remains open only until the end of the transition period. Finally, when it comes to healthcare, all EU citizens, currently including Brits, have the right to receive care in any other EU country, getting fully or partially reimbursed by their home country. If you didn't know this already, you might already be familiar with it, knowing it as the EHIC system, which has allowed Brits to gain healthcare while abroad for many years. The right to healthcare continues throughout the transition period, but access could end for Brits, depending on the type of deal that's reached. Both the NHS and EU have published documents explaining how care abroad will be impacted by Brexit, and we've linked to both of those documents down below. So, what have you learned in this video? Essentially, anything you want to do during the 2020 transition period will likely be unaffected. Brits can still travel, work, retire, study, gain funding, and seek treatment in the EU until the end of the year. A number of those rights could be protected by the trade deal that the UK and EU are currently working on, but they aren't guaranteed after 2020. Ultimately, it's the end of the transition period, December 31st, 2020, that will prove more important. The Institute for Government's Getting Brexit Done report states exactly this, saying that the political realities of Brexit will not be felt on the 1st of January 2020. The transition period is a largely standstill agreement, preserving the status quo. The change at the end of the transition will, on the other hand, be significant. Under the deal envisaged by the government, border controls and checks will come into force. A new immigration system must be put in place to replace free movement. Changes to fisheries and agricultural policy will begin, and public bodies and regulators will need to take on new roles and responsibilities. The realities of Brexit, from a practical and administrative perspective, will be obvious for the first time at the end of 2020. Government, businesses, and individuals will need to be ready. There is still a lot for both sides to decide, and it's not until the end of 2021 that the true impact will hit. As time goes on, we'll learn more about the deal that the UK and EU negotiate, and when we do, we'll better understand what's going to happen in 2021. Although I know it's late in the video to go on this slight tangent, and I know we'll get accused of padding out the video, but it's worth noting the transition period doesn't have to end on December 31st, 2020. The withdrawal agreement allows for an extension of 1 or 2 years, so until December 31st, 2021 or 2022. Both sides have to sign off on the extension, and it has to be agreed before the end of June, but this transition period could definitely be extended. This would push the big day for change back, giving both sides longer to negotiate, as well as extending the period of status quo for work, travel, retirement, study, funding, and healthcare. What we do know for now is that on February 1st, very little is set to change. The real day to keep an eye on is the end of the transition period, whenever that ends up being. As I said earlier, we'll make a video towards the end of 2020 explaining what changes at the next deadline. So if you're willing to wait the several months for a deal to be reached, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Also, the video about how EU citizens will be affected is going to be out later this week, so subscribe to the EU channel for that video, and the channel is linked below. Special thanks to all of our Patreons who you can see on screen now, who have supported us